Okay, well, it's 11 o'clock, so we might as well get started here. Today, I'm going to start covering the sixth chapter in the Gary Clee textbook that you will have an assigned reading in. That reading is from pages 143 to, let's see, 168. But there are a lot of illustrations in there, and it's not that hard. It's not that slow of a reading. But we're talking about rangelands, and rangeland as a term generally refers to grasslands or areas that are not forested but are utilized for grazing or for just wildlife habitat. The United States Department of Agriculture defines rangeland as land on which the potential natural vegetation is predominantly grasses or grass-like plants, forbs, or shrubs, including land revegetated naturally or artificially that is managed like native vegetation. Rangeland includes natural grasses or natural grasslands, savannas, shrublands, most deserts, tundra, alpine communities, coastal marshes, and wet meadows that are less than 10% stocked with forest trees of any size. So less than 10% of trees are kind of the cutoff. Thing to remember about what rangelands are and are not is that there are some human managed types of grasslands that we would call pasture lands that are typically what farmers and ranchers would call improved pasture land. And improved pasture land would include things like a Bermuda grass pasture here in Oklahoma. That pasture is fenced off from livestock, or maybe livestock are put into the pasture periodically. But the important thing is that the pasture grasses are managed. They're fertilized, perhaps certain types of grasses are planted or sown. And so that would not be a rangeland, even though the land is used for grazing cattle or horses or sheep or something. So a pasture that's managed is technically not a rangeland. Rangelands exist as natural, mostly treeless land, and generally they're large areas of either private or public land. They can be utilized by livestock or utilized by ranchers, but they don't have to be. So a lot of the lands of the Great Plains that are not used for agriculture are considered rangelands. There are any sort of pasture that is just unimproved would be classified as a rangeland. So as long as there's not, intensive management of the grazing vegetation, then we have a rangeland. So most of the rangelands are located in areas where precipitation falls below 30 inches. So in central Oklahoma, we're right at that boundary between rangeland resources and areas that are farmed generally. So let's see here. See if anybody's coming in. Is anybody here yet? Jeffrey. Hey, Jeffrey, how's it going? How are you doing this morning, Jeffrey? Hey, I got started a little bit already, but I was just defining what rangelands are, and you can catch that in the recording, but generally a rangeland is any land that's good for grazing or not good for grazing that is not managed by humans in the way that a pasture would be managed. So no improvement of vegetation, um, no artificial fertilizers or anything. So there are a lot of different types of rangeland. They can include marshlands that are used for grazing. They can include uh, mountain mountain meadows or um, tundra even. So uh, the areas up in the on the north slope of Alaska that support caribou would be referred to as a rangeland landscape. So mostly, however, most rangelands are not taken up for agriculture. They tend to exist in really large areas, large plots of non-agricultural area. So it's you know it's a doesn't necessarily have to be a grassland, but most rangelands in the United States are open for some sort of grazing. A lot of the a lot of the grazing lands in the United States also are technically forested lands. So we don't count anything that has more than 10% of forest cover as rangeland. All right, so in the United States, in terms of the lower 48 states at least, um, grasslands, about 2/3 of the original grasslands have been um, utilized for some sort of cropland. And this is mostly in what's today the Corn Belt. And some of that has been put into permanent pasture land. So that wouldn't necessarily count as rangeland. So we've had a depletion of rangelands because of the expansion of agriculture. So anyway, generally the area from about 30 to maybe even 33 inches of rainfall per year and lower are areas that are mostly rangeland in the United States today. So that's where you find the bulk of it. Most of the rangeland and the vast majority of rangeland in the United States is found in the Great Plains and the Intermountain West. So we're generally talking about the western half of the United States when we're examining rangelands. So enough of the definitions there. Now, when we speak of rangelands, we're usually referring to, in terms of a resource, we're talking about our grazing resource. And in the United States, so the territory of the United States, rangelands began to be used for livestock in some way as early as 500 years ago. And in 1519, Ponce de Leon introduced agriculture or introduced European livestock in the form of cattle to Florida, and cattle then became feral in the Southeast. So the first introduction of cattle came into the Southeast. I think I probably talked about that before. But mostly rangelands in the United States became used in a large extent in the middle part of the 19th century, and the great cattle drives from South Texas up into the Kansas and Nebraska railroad towns, and then later on from Texas into the central and the northern plains for summertime grazing, really began the utilization of the western rangelands by Americans. Of course, the utilization of the western rangelands on the Great Plains was necessitated or was made possible by the elimination of the bison. So, do you happen to know any idea, Jeffrey, when the American bison was essentially removed from the Great Plains? when they were slaughtered?
Early 1900s, I believe.
It's actually a little earlier than that. The Transcontinental Railroad, the Union Pacific and the California Pacific lines connected in 1869 in Promontory Point, Utah. All right. The railroads then, once they were able to cross the continent, began to expand out into the Great Plains, and the railroads enabled the slaughter of the buffalo and wholesale, because they were able to transport hides and later bone, and there was a market for buffalo hides. The other thing was buffalo hunters like Buffalo Bill and many others were active in hunting bison, and one of the main reasons they did that was because there was a bounty placed on them by the United States government. So the price of bison hides and bison meat was artificially rose artificially because it was subsidized by the federal government. Now, why would the federal government want to artificially subsidize the slaughter of bison?
Was it because they saw it as something they had an abundance of?
Not really. Well, they did have an abundance of it, but the American bison were the key to gaining control of the central and northern plains during the 1870s. From 1869 up until about 1880, throughout the 1870s, the United States was at war, and particularly from about 1867 to about 1876, the United States was fighting Indian wars against the central and northern plains Indian tribes, the Sioux, various tribes of the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho. The Cheyenne were located in both the northern and the central and southern plains. A number of other tribes, the Comanches in South and Texas. And the plains tribes were very mobile. They were not as complacent to go to reservations, and because they were still rather powerful. They depended on the bison. And after the Civil War, it became the policy that the United States would, the term was placate or pacify the Indian tribes of the central and northern plains. And they weren't able to do that. And when the tribes resisted the attempt to get them to settle down on reservations, federal government subsidized the slaughter of the bison, and that, of course, took away the resource base, not just the food resource base, but the material resource base of the plains tribes. So eliminating that resource really brought the central and northern Great Plains tribes to their knees, and they really didn't have much ability to fight after the bison were gone. They couldn't become mobile. So the couple of important years were 1867 and 1868. Those were the years that reservations were established in places like Oklahoma and South Dakota. The Great Sioux Reservation and the various reservations in Indian Territory were established then, but the establishment of those reservations is what really began the hostilities between the Plains tribes and the government, mostly because a lot of the bands of the various tribes refused to to go to reservations, or once they were on reservations, they decided this wasn't for them, and so they went back um, and and were out of the control of the government. Well, another reason for the slaughter of the bison, of course, was demand for those grasslands by cattle raisers who were just beginning in 1866 to utilize the Great Plains grasslands for of the central and the northern Great Plains for cattle ranching. The ranches really didn't come about. The great cattle ranches of the central and northern plains really didn't appear until after about 1880. But beginning around 1880 is when barbed wire became available and the plains began to be parceled up into ranches. Okay. Barbed wire itself was invented by the Glidden Company. You may know Glidden from paint production these days, but Glidden was the originator of manufactured steel barbed wire. But even though it was invented and started to be produced around the mid 1870s, it wasn't available in large amounts until about 1880. And then, even then, ranchers typically didn't have the cash to fence off the range. The earliest big ranches that utilized barbed wire were actually sort of corporate ranches. A lot of them were financed by English and particularly Scottish financiers, because it required an enormous amount of money to lay out barbed wire fences and also to purchase cattle. So some of the great ranches of the central and northern plains were, and probably of the panhandle of Texas and western Oklahoma eventually, were owned by these big corporate, basically investor ranches. Now that was the initial step toward eliminating the open range. Of course, there are movies called Open Range, right? And it's about the fencing of the Great Plains, fencing of the open range. But it was fairly easy for the big ranchers to take control of large areas of the plains and of grazing lands merely by fencing off the Galleria forested rivers and creeks. Because if you could control the water sources, if you can control access to the water sources, then you could pretty much control all the land in between, the water sources. So oftentimes they didn't have to fence very much. They could control large areas just by fencing off water sources and laying claim to those water sources. You see this up in the sandhills of Nebraska, especially in western South Dakota. So once the bison were eliminated, once the Indians were confined to reservations, you begin to see the utilization of the open range. And then with the advent of barbed wire in the 1880s, begin to see the fencing up of the open range. Okay, so by 1890, much of the best grasslands in the plains had become claimed. It started to be claimed. They certainly weren't all fenced, but you begin to see, and even in places like western Kansas, farmers no longer able to, or ranchers no longer able to use the open range. And so that leads to movements like the Boomer movement, and that led to the opening of Oklahoma, because Oklahoma was land that wasn't being used, at least the western half of the state, other than the Indian reservations, where most of the Indian population was confined to the areas around the agencies, very small areas. So it was it became a very popular and actually a populist political football to open up those lands that had not been assigned to Indian reservations. And so things like the unassigned lands here in central Oklahoma were opened up to land runs, mostly to farmers. Okay, so I mean, they were claimed by farmers, but in the early 1890s through the mid 1890s, we also see agriculture being affected by cyclical climatic changes in the Great Plains. So one of the most severe droughts occurred in the early part of the 1870s. So we've talked a little bit about the access to the bison that the Indians had, and then when the United States was waging war against the Plains tribes, one of those factors that led to the end of the bison herd. I should say that once the Transcontinental Railroad went through the middle part of the plains. Let me share the screen. I didn't think to do that. Let's see here. Once this is from your reading, and I'll try to blow it up a little bit. So the area I'm talking about is mostly here in the Great Plains, the area from eastern Montana down through the Panhandle of Texas, and including Wyoming and Colorado and New Mexico and North South Dakota, most of western Nebraska, western Kansas, northwest Oklahoma. That area was the historic range of the great bison herds. The Transcontinental Railroad followed the Platte River, so the Transcontinental Railroad went right about through here. Can you see that at all? Are you able to see that? Okay. And so in 1869 is when the bison herd, the great bison herds of the plains, were separated between a northern herd and a southern herd. The southern herd was down here mostly in eastern Colorado and around the Panhandle of Oklahoma. And the northern herd was up here in the Dakotas mostly. And so once they were divided, buffalo hunters were able to thin them out faster on either side of the Transcontinental Railroad line. Now, while that was taking place, the slaughter of the bison was kind of assisted by a drought. And so bison, of course, ended up congregating around water sources and that sort of thing. So that drought lasted to about 1876. And it's also a time, that was also a time when some of the agricultural settlement had extended into the Great Plains from places like western Kansas and western Nebraska into places like eastern Colorado. And during the 1870s, you have this, farmers who had settled that far west were hit hard by drought and actually abandoned it in large numbers. Okay, so the bison herds get mostly wiped out by the 1880s, or by 1880 or so. Agriculture is not really expanding into this area because of the drought. And the Great Plains cattle drives and the cattle trails began to extend westward. The first cattle trails were like, the eastern trails, like the East Shawnee Trail, which went up into Missouri from Texas. But then the next one that was probably most famous is the one that follows US 81 through western Oklahoma, the Chisholm Trail. Chisholm Trail is probably something you've heard of if you're from Oklahoma. But there are also later trails like the Great Western Trail and the one that goes up through the Panhandle of Texas, which I can't remember at the moment. Anyway, so there are other trails that were connecting Central and South Texas with the Northern Plains. And those cattle trails established the ranching culture of the Great Plains in the 1880s. So, and the cattle drives really didn't last that long. They got started, the first ones got started a little bit before the Civil War, but they weren't of any consequence. The big cattle drive started in 1866, right after the end of the Civil War. And those cattle drives then brought mostly Southerners and Texans into the Central and Northern Great Plains. So they established, kind of a cowboy culture of the Great Plains. The Great Plains would, from then on, become a cattle kingdom. And those great ranches that got established in the 1880s, once the barbed wire came in and once British finances came into play, those big cattle ranches got established in the 1880s and continued on into the 1890s and the early 1900s. So you're familiar with the Panhandle of Oklahoma?
Vaguely.
Now, you're from Tulsa, aren't you? The Tulsa area? Okay. Have you ever been to the Panhandle of Oklahoma by chance?
I've been up around Alfalfa County, like the Salt Lake Plains.
Yeah. Around Cherokee.
Yeah, Cherokee, Oklahoma.
Cherokee or Jet.
Yeah, I've got grandparents live in Cherokee, and that's where I'm going hunting. So.
Great. Okay, so you go to the Great Salt Plains. I see. Nash. You ever heard of Nash?
Yeah, I've never been there though.
Helena. My grandmother used to live in Helena, Oklahoma, which is spelled just like Helena, Montana. Well, that's pretty close to the Panhandle, but it's not quite there. You're in Alfalfa County. That's pretty far northwest. A lot of people in Oklahoma, I would say probably the majority of Oklahomans, have never even visited the Panhandle. And I like to ask that question, and I appreciate your honesty. But the Panhandle of Oklahoma is so incredibly different than the rest of the state, especially once you get west of Guyman, Oklahoma, which is here in the center. It's kind of the largest town. But the reason I'm asking you that is Oklahoma, the Panhandle of Oklahoma was added on to Oklahoma Territory in 1890. Do you know what the Oklahoma Panhandle was before 1890?
Was it Indian land?
It was never Indian land.
Indian land.
Well, it was, I guess, technically prior to 1867. 1867 was the Treaty of Medicine Lodge Creek up in Kansas, in which the Southern Cheyennes ceded claim to the Southern Plains, and so that would have been technically. But it used to be part of Texas. Okay, so the Oklahoma Panhandle was part of Texas until 1850. Okay, and of course before that, it was part of Mexico. Right, it was Texas. Before Texas independence in 1836, it was part of Mexico from 1821 to 1836. And then before 1821, of course, it was part of Spain. Okay, it was part of New Spain and the Viceroyalty of New Spain. And it was administered out of, the metropolis of the northern provinces of New Spain, which was Santa Fe. Okay, and there's a reason I'm telling you this. So throughout the 1700s up until probably the late 1700s, early 1800s, the area around the Oklahoma Panhandle was actually being colonized by Spanish sheep herders. Okay, at least the part of the Oklahoma Panhandle that is Cimarron County today. It's the short grass country of the Panhandle. And there were Spanish sheep ranchers that were coming out of northeastern New Mexico that settled some of the area. Well, after in 1850, you might know a little bit about Texas history. In 1850, the United States passed what would be called the Missouri Compromise. You familiar with the Missouri Compromise?
I've heard
Okay.
about it in like high school, but it's been a while.
Yeah, the Missouri Compromise in 1850 was the compromise to limit slavery to south of the what is the parallel that would become the northern boundary of Texas. Okay, the northern boundary of the Texas Panhandle. That parallel, which I'd have to cheat and look at my map to see what exactly it is. I can't remember exactly. It's 30. Anyway, I won't bother with that. But that northern east-west line became the northern limit of slavery in the United States. Now that's prior to the Civil War. So the state of Texas in 1850, just 5 years after it was annexed by the United States, lost those that northern territory, which included not just the Oklahoma Panhandle, but it went up into Colorado. Okay, so what that did, and I'm getting back at the Panhandle again. What that did was the southern boundary of Kansas had already been established in 1850. So it left that 30, I think it's 36 square mile or 36 mile wide strip. Maybe it's a little wider than that. Have to check here. One, 2, 3, 4. 7 times 6. I think it's 42 miles wide, or 42 miles, something like that. So it left that strip unclaimed by Kansas, and it couldn't be claimed by Texas because Texas was a slave state in 1850. So it wound up, and it was not part of Indian territory. Okay, so it became known as no man's land. It was just this chunk of it was a rectangular chunk of land that had no claim to it. Okay, so from 1850 until 1890, when it was attached to Oklahoma territory, for those 40 years, it was just called no man's land, and there was no state associated with it. And because there was no territory or state associated with it, it was lawless. There was no authority at all within that area. So it became kind of an area that was sort of open for ranching and open for the use of grazing land by anybody who would come in to use it. Mostly it was used by Texas ranchers in the Texas Panhandle. And so during the 1880s is when most of it became a ranch country, all right? So 1880s, the Oklahoma Panhandle is this ranch country, and it's of course grassland, and it was controlled mostly by a family who would later become pretty famous in the Panhandle, known as the Hitches. You ever heard of the Hitch Ranch?
No.
Okay. The Hitch family was, so there was a sort of well, I won't get into the specifics, but the Hitch Ranch controlled much of the land of the Oklahoma Panhandle, and then so you have basically ranchers control in this area until it becomes part of Oklahoma territory in 1890. Well, they would continue to ranch the place because there was no need for agriculture didn't expand into the Oklahoma Panhandle until about the I'd say accurately, we could say about 1915. Okay. Well, as you know, the Oklahoma Panhandle and northwestern Oklahoma became part of the wheat belt. And so agriculture expanded into that area when World War I began to encourage farmers to move west into the semi-arid high plains. And because the United States government wanted to ensure that that the Allied powers during World War I received food, the United States government was able to encourage a lot of farmers to move into those new lands of the West. They utilized tractors for the first time. A lot of the farmers that moved into the Western high plains had been pretty successful and had enough capital to purchase mechanized, equipment like tractors and things. Some of the first tractors. So during World War I, from 1914, of course, the United States doesn't enter World War I until 1917. Even though we didn't enter the war, we were making a lot of foreign, foreign exchange, foreign trade by feeding the Allied powers. And so the United States subsidized the price of wheat and encouraged the plowing up of the high plains, particularly the southern plains. So that period is called the Great Plow Up, when the high plains began to be cultivated for the very first time. They had to cut sod, and it was a difficult achievement, but they were able to do it. And then, of course, what happened is a lot of that land was opened up for agriculture. And during the 1920s, immediately after World War I, the federal government quit subsidizing wheat and cotton and other things. And agriculture began to experience a recession. And some people call it a depression. Throughout the 1920s, agricultural commodity prices fell. Nevertheless, credit was pretty cheap during the 1920s. And so what happened was a lot of the farmers, even though they were losing money because of the prices of their commodities kept falling, what they would do is they would increase their acreage by purchasing or borrowing for leasing more land. So even though the price of even though they were kind of fighting that downward drop in commodity prices, they were trying to make up for it by increasing their yield, increasing their acreage. So by the 1930s, we have lots and lots of large farms in the southern high plains producing wheat, primarily wheat. And of course, in the 1930s, the agricultural prices plummet even more once the stock market crashes in October of 1929, and then the Federal Reserve fails to fix it. And so by 1931, there's a serious depression. The Great Depression pretty much shows up in 1931 or so with unemployment levels. At the same time is when another one of those cyclical droughts hit. And the drought began about 1931 and didn't end until about 1937 or 38. And that's the period of the Great Plains calls the Dust Bowl years. And the 1930s drought was no worse than previous droughts, like in the 1870s, and there was another one in the 1890s. And there was an even more severe drought in the 1950s, and again in the 1980s, and then more recently, just about 2009 to about, well, in some places it's continuing, but 2009 to about 2015.
What was the difference between the drought that they experienced during this period of time?
That was exactly the question I was hoping you would ask. That's the important question. The important question is why the 1930s was a Dust Bowl, the 1950s wasn't, or the 1890s wasn't. It's because of the fact that it was plowed up. It was cultivated and had been cultivated intensively for about a decade or so. And once the drought hit, they continued to plow anyway. So in the season of 1931 and 32 and 33, what farmers would do, they would assume that rains were going to come next year, and they continued to plow it up. And when they plowed it up, they fried the soil. They fried the soil so much that it became pulverized, and it was so lacking moisture that it was easily airborne into dust storms. So it was lost. The soil was largely lost because of the wind's always blowing on the southern plains, but when the land is opened up, when it was not covered with grass or not covered with crops, it blew away. And so we have the southern plains were the areas where the Dust Bowl was worst. Basically an area from southeastern Colorado, southwestern Kansas, Oklahoma Panhandle, the Texas Panhandle, and northeastern New Mexico. Now, what?
I'm not sure if it was my computer or your computer, but all of the audio was cut out from what.
Oh, okay.
So I'm gonna go ahead and exit and then try to come back in because I don't know if it's a me issue or.
Okay. All right. I'll let you back in. Go ahead. How's that? Can you hear me now?
Yes, I'll
Okay.
go back and I'll view whatever I missed.
Okay. Well, the idea was that we had massive amounts of soil loss during the Dust Bowl years, the 1930s, not because of a drought, but because of the combination of a drought and intensive agriculture to produce wheat. That intensive agriculture wouldn't have existed had the United States not subsidized wheat production and encouraged farmers to go into the high plains, providing cheap credit or subsidizing credit. And also, of course, the First World War had a lot to do with it. But it was the fact that it had been cultivated, and then a drought hit, and then the farmers continued to cultivate it with the hope that the rains would return, and the rains never return. So massive amounts of soil loss or aeolian soil erosion occurred. And it's not to say that soil erosion still doesn't occur. It does. It really does throughout the southern plains. But this was during that drought period was when you had just an enormous amount, which to the extent that which farmers were displaced from the plains, about anywhere from a quarter to half of the population in the Oklahoma Panhandle left during the 1930s. Some of them stayed, but agriculture wouldn't be the same for a while. And what happened was during the late 1930s, a lot of that land that had been cultivated in the southern plains, southwest Kansas, southeast Colorado, Oklahoma, Texas Panhandle, northeast New Mexico, a lot of those lands were placed into conservation reserve. A lot of those lands were um, were often through the direction of the federal government by way of the Soil Conservation Service. A lot of those private lands were placed into a situation in which they were not plowed. They were intentionally not plowed, or intentionally not cultivated for crops. And so that was a New Deal era program. The Soil Conservation Service was created in the 1930s during the Dust Bowl. It would later become the chief federal agency to encourage conservation, not just soil conservation, but to encourage conservation on private land in the United States. So that's a really important facet of federal policy that got started in the Dust Bowl area and the Southern Plains. Today, or since 1994, since the Clinton administration, the Soil Conservation Service has been known as the Natural Resources Conservation Service, the NRCS. And they're responsible for working with private landowners to encourage conservation easements and to encourage conservation practices. So that's we've talked about them with farmland a little bit, but it makes sense to revisit them for rangeland, because the Dust Bowl era was, a natural but somewhat human-caused disaster. Mostly, and what it teaches us is the significance of rangeland as a conservation, a natural resource that preserves other resources. Okay, so and this is what makes the unit on rangeland so fascinating to me, is that you don't think of grasslands as being that significant. A lot of people, unfortunately, refer to the Great Plains as flyover country, as there's nothing to see, or if they're driving to California from, on I-40, there's nothing to see between like Oklahoma City and, Phoenix. So, unfortunately, fact is, the grasslands of the United States are key to so many other natural resources. Grasslands are huge, unappreciated sinks of carbon. Okay, lots of, we think automatically of forests when we think of carbon sequestration, but grasslands also grasslands have huge amounts of biomass. And because they're so large and because they're so stable and permanent, that they offer an enormous amount of carbon sequestration possibilities or potential. Other things that people generally don't appreciate about grasslands is they hold the soil. They hold soil resources. They prevent soil from, they keep the soil healthy. The most fertile soils on the planet come from grasslands for agriculture. Okay, so the most fertile type of soil order of the great soil orders, which you've maybe watched in another video, are the mollisols. Mollisols form under grassland, and they are slightly alkaline, very humus-rich soils that develop over long periods of time. They're very thick, and they develop as grasses slowly decompose. So they have a very thick O horizon. But one of the other things that grasslands do, of course, is support lots of wildlife. You're going out to Northwest Oklahoma to duck hunt or hunt white-tailed deer or something?
It's going to be white-tailed deer.
Okay.
But
So go ahead.
Well, I last time I made a visit out there, some of the forested area, I had noticed that they were cutting down a lot of the trees because they were trying to expand the area where their bird reservation was, and that was pretty cool project it looked like they were doing.
That's a federal property out there too.
Mm-hmm.
Run by the U.S. Fish and Game, Fish and Wildlife Service. So okay, so the southern, the Great Plains, the grassland supports enormous herds, and historically has supported enormous herds of wildlife, bison, but also pronghorn antelope. Before that, there were archaic bison. There were woolly mammoths, in the Ice Age. So grasslands have always supported huge numbers of wildlife, just like the Serengeti of Africa today. This North American grasslands have always been significant for supporting wildlife. But in addition to all that, water resources. Water resources are conserved with grass cover, with even short grasses, but grasslands are fantastic water savers. They allow the movement of rainwater whenever it occurs, the movement of rainwater vertically down into the soil. So with grass cover, you're not going to have a massive amount of fluvial erosion, because grasses themselves are designed to move. When I say design, okay, grasses themselves move water from the surface down into the root system, and of course into the water table. Not all of the water is going to be utilized by the grass itself, but there are some areas where you find grasses that have roots that span several meters down into the soil. We don't think of that too much, but really long root systems. And the wonderful thing about grasses too is that, unlike forests, when you cut a tree and the tree's dead, grasslands have evolved to be consumed at the top, and they don't die, or they'll burn, and then the root systems, if the fire isn't too intense, isn't too hot, the grasses always come back. The grasses are perennial, or if they're annuals, they'll reseed. So grasses have an enormous capability for rejuvenation and for being permanent, and having the ability to bounce back, whether they're grazed or burned. And that's something that, and they're fast growing. They regenerate very, very quickly. So resilience is the key there. Grasslands are resilient. And it's only when we remove grasses entirely for agriculture that we break that system down. So nowadays we're doing pretty well with keeping land out of productivity or out of cultivation for conservation. And I just wanted to mention that the drought of the middle part of the 1950s was much more severe than the one in the 1930s. Yet we didn't have a dust bowl in the 1950s, and that was largely because land was taken out of agriculture and kept for grazing. One last thing before we go, and that is, I just read this the other day in a new book, but as far as landscapes go, most of the world's land that is occupied in some way or utilized by human beings is, of course, utilized for food production, right? We all know that. The vast amount of land that is used for food production is in the form of rangelands for grazing cattle and sheep, and a few other types of livestock, but mostly cattle. Certainly in the United States, the vast amount of rangeland that is producing any type of food is cattle ranching land, cattle grazing land. So I'll have some videos for you, and some of these videos are a little controversial. One of the more controversial ones is the idea that rangelands, grasslands thrive when large herds of livestock or large herds of ungulates, of herbivores, occupy that grassland. So there are some people who subscribe to the philosophy that, or maybe a science, that without large herds of grazing animals like bison, without those large herds, the grasslands don't do as well. Okay. On the other hand, there are people who don't believe that. Have you ever heard, Jeffrey? Have you ever heard of the idea of, what was it called? The Buffalo Commons. You ever heard of that term?
No, I haven't.
Okay. There was, back in I think it was the 1980s. Yeah, it was the 1980s. Some academics at Rutgers University, husband-wife team of I believe they were, I'm not really sure, maybe biologists. They came up with this proposal that because there's so much damage done to grasslands by farmers and ranchers in the United States, that it would make sense for the United States government to purchase lands and take them out of production on the high plains, to purchase all the agricultural lands on the high plains and return bison herds to the Great Plains. The idea of having a gargantuan national park or national grassland that bison could once again range on. And the bison, of course, they used to range north and south. Right. So they go south, in the wintertime, and they go back north in the summertime. And the idea would be that to allow the bison herds to do that once again and to bring back the natural system that they had in place. Of course, if you're a rancher or a farmer in the Great Plains, you think that's about the most ridiculous thing you've ever heard in your life, right? So that's why we have a little bit of controversy. I should also mention one other thing, and that is, even though we've talked a lot about the no man's land and the area of the Panhandle, in 1910, 1915, there was only one or two counties in the state of Oklahoma that did not have any production of corn. And those were Texas County and Cimarron County. Maybe it was just Cimarron County. Didn't have any corn production in the agricultural census. I think it was probably 1910 or 1914 or something like that. Today, however, the most agriculturally profitable, the most agriculturally significant county in the state of Oklahoma is Texas County, by far. More agricultural products are produced in Texas County, Oklahoma, the central county of the Oklahoma Panhandle, than all the other counties in the state of Oklahoma. And that's in the form of corn, okay? And a lot of other types of grain like maize, some wheat, but also it produces an enormous amount of pork and cattle. And that's another thing that we might get into a little bit later. We've talked a little bit about that before. But so rangelands, we haven't even gotten into the Mountain West rangelands, but we'll talk about those next time. We'll talk about the types of depletion that we see in the rangelands, primarily overgrazing, issues that are associated with overgrazing. But it's a fascinating topic, and so I'm just going to leave you with the request that you read the chapter that I'm about to post on the Canvas page under the module for the second midterm exam. Okay.
Okay.
Well, I've just rambled on here for an hour, so I'll shut up and let you get to reading.
I did have, sorry for the clicking and stuff. I had to pull up map of all the Oklahoma counties just so I could keep up with you.
That's fine. No problem at all.
I thought it was interesting The way you talked about the subsidies for the land production as far as like soil
Yeah,
conservation, because I
yeah.
had a course at my previous college where I had a professor criticize stuff like that, and he said he was came from a very conservative mindset where he was saying it was encouraging people to not farm, and it was basically paying farmers not to farm, and it was just like a scam. So it was interesting to hear your perspective where you spun it in like a way that it made sense to me.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, subsidies can do lots of harm. Don't get me wrong. I'm anti-subsidy in most every case. However, when it's conservation reserve, if a farmer has a reason to conserve soil or to most of the day, most of the types of conservation reserve programs now are to encourage wildlife habitat. So, taking a subsidy versus ruining the soil resource, the subsidies really aren't that huge anymore. So it's not like you're going to get rich. It's kind of a way to avoid neglecting the land because you have to pay taxes on the land. But those, the taxes also vary from state to state. In Oklahoma, agricultural land, taxes on agricultural land are very, very minimal, and they are generally not, would not be a reason for a farmer to farm, even though the land shouldn't be farmed, or grazed, even though the land shouldn't be grazed.
What that professor says is whenever they started doing that, what the larger farms would do is they would buy more land. So they wouldn't actually decrease their production. They would just add more land because they could deal with the tax better than like having to cut down actual production.
Well, I'm sure that your other professor has a really good argument there. So, and that may have been an economics course or something like that. But the conservation reserve program that's been in place for the last 30 or 40 years has allowed a lot of land to go into rangeland that was in cropland, and generally that's a good thing. Um, but of course, all that money is going to be coming out of the USDA budget, and so that's why farm bills are pretty controversial. A lot of the money that goes into things like conservation reserve will actually be going into corporate farms because they've bought up these large areas of land. Okay, so that doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. That the federal government should be subsidizing corporations. So I'm against that personally. But when it comes to sort of helping a landowner make a decision about what types of activity should be taking place, if it's in favor of conservation, if it makes sense, I'd probably be for it. But
How did you feel about the what you explained with the Buffalo Commons?
oh well, the Buffalo Commons idea I think is pretty far fetched. Um, but I don't believe the United States government should be purchasing land from, it would never happen. I don't think it would ever be a
Probably
possibility.
not.
Just politically, it would never happen. So, and I think landowners generally can make the best decisions for themselves without some central government telling them what to do, or taking the land themselves. It's just not something that's very American.
Right. I do like the idea though of returning like natural populations to land.
Mhm.
Like we've seen with like here in the past with the wolves in Yellowstone. Now that
Mhm.
land obviously is already owned or protected, so it's not really the public or private owned land. So it's a little bit of a different deal. But by just reintroducing them, they're seeing all these changes, positive changes in the ecosystems there. So that's sort of the idea with the buffalo is by introducing them is the land would benefit greatly from that.
That's a great example, actually, because Yellowstone's a large, large area, right?
Yeah.
Yellowstone's a huge area right here, and on this map, it's recognized as mostly ungrazed. Okay. Now, introducing timber wolves back into Yellowstone National Parks, might be good for the, the bison population in Yellowstone and the moose population and the elk population. But surrounding Yellowstone are a lot of ranchers, and they don't like that program whatsoever because the wolves have expanded out. The wolves don't pay any attention to the park boundaries.
Of course.
And so now you have timber wolves that are preying on calves and making it more and more difficult for ranchers to make a living out there. But that's a great point. Interesting point. Well, I'm glad you're keeping up with this, and hopefully see you tomorrow.
Yeah.
All right. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Take care, sir.